Robert J. Bob Bonamart, and Jared Belnap. And Jared is the president of Mazuma Capital Corporation, and Bob is on the board of that corporation. And it's a corporation that leases products, mostly equipment, right? And they're going to explain what they do and how they do it. And it's a matter of a financing transaction. And I think you'll find that it's quite fascinating. I have found it to be. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce Jared Belnap. And let's give him a hand.
Thank you. Great. Well, as Rick mentioned, we're an equipment leasing company, and basically we provide capital equipment to corporations around the country. We see all industries, all types of equipment. We're on the forefront of capital investment and capital acquisition, so we really get a good leading economic indicator of what's happening in the economy. And it's an interesting business. We're going to talk a little bit about equipment leasing, what it means, how it works, and a little bit about Mazuma, and talk to you a little bit about what we anticipate will happen through 2013, some of the economic trends that we're seeing, and how we see that'll impact our business. Okay, so this is kind of our motto, building relationships by delivering on our commitments. This is quite large in equipment leasing. We see a lot of companies that make commitments or promises for financing that they can't deliver, particularly as of post-2008 with the economic meltdown. It's somewhat of a challenge to get the approvals necessary to move forward and fund transactions. Okay, so Mazuma is an interesting name. Everyone always asks me, where'd you come up with that? It's not Montezuma. So it's not Montezuma's Revenge, it's Mazuma. And if you'll hit that, that means it's slang, and it's what it means is money, cash, fixed currency, from the Sonic Hebrew term for fast cash or ready money. Ready money is one of our distinct and unique competitive advantages. In our industry, the ability to turn a transaction around from start to finish in a very expedient time frame is critical. It's one of the things that really separates us from many of our competitors. So we've been known to, in certain situations, turn a transaction, say $2 or $3 million around from our initial contact to funding in as short as 5 business days. That's a pretty unheard of turnaround time, particularly in this economy. Next still, thank you. So this is our company history. We started September 7th, 2005. We commenced business as a national direct lease originator. We incorporated in the state of Utah. We lease to really across all industries. We look for middle market tier credits, but we lease to both public and private companies whose market cap would place them within the scope of the Wilshire 5,000 index of companies. Our principals tender about 125 plus years of experience. Maybe a little bit more with some of our board members. And we go all the way back to really, we've got quite a pedigree of equipment leasing experience with our chief credit officer involved in Greyhound and some of the first guys that got involved with equipment leasing in the United States. So pretty fantastic history with that. We're 100%, almost 100% owner operated. So we thrive as the vested stakeholders and shareholders oversee the day-to-day operations with no hidden agendas. Alrighty. So this is a little bit about me. I got into this industry in 1998. At the time, I worked for a company that Bob sat on the board of. And that company was Matrix Funding Corporation. I started in sales as an account executive where I closed more than 30 million in lease transactions. I transitioned through to marketing manager and vice president, and when I left, I was being groomed for the EVP position. And as America operates, you find a good model. You look at what you think are great ideas with that model, think of creative ways to expand it, and go out and try it on your own, and that's essentially what we did. And since that time, personally, I've closed over $500 million in lease transactions, and it's given me quite an experience in this industry. The rest of this just kind of goes through our executive staff. Doug is one of the guys that's been around with Greyhound Leasing for a long, long time. He's our chief credit officer. He would cringe if I said that title. He likes to go by EVP of credit and syndication, but he's our chief credit officer. Our Chief Financial Officer, Richard Bynan. We have an Executive Vice President and General Counsel that oversees our operations department. Mr. Burrows is our President, EVP of Sales, and heads up our sales floor. The next deal, we'll go through a few more key employees. Our Vice President of Vendor Relations and Vendor Services, David Ekman. Kristen Jones handles our operations, and Julie handles all of our strategic marketing and development. We have a total of about 32 employees right now, and located in Draper. All right, so industry overview. This is a fascinating industry. Most businesses require equipment in order to operate, and in many cases to make a profit. So equipment leasing is vital, absolutely vital to most businesses in today's economy. They need equipment to produce goods and services to take to market. Unfortunately, equipment costs money, and it's expensive. That's where leasing and financing comes into play. And so each business needs to evaluate how they're going to acquire that equipment. If they have available cash on their balance sheet and in their books, if they need to go to their mainstream creditors and look for a banking relationship, or utilize things like equipment leasing and financing. So we're responsible for financing a substantial portion of the nation's capital expenditures, not us, but equipment finance in general. And we do that through a multitude of financial products and strategies. To give you some insight into how large this industry really is, there's over $7 trillion in equipment currently leased in the United States. That's a large number. Last year, it went up from $1.1 trillion in 2012 to $1.3 trillion in equipment acquisition last year, with some 54% increasing from 51% in 2012 to 54% in 2012, which represented roughly $702 billion that was leased or financed last year, up from $630 billion. So it's a tremendous industry. Great. So these are some of the industries and equipment types that we work with. We run the gamut: aviation, construction, aerospace, trucking, agriculture, information technology. We do a lot in mining. We're seeing a lot in gas and oil, renewable energies, manufacturing, energy waste, telecommunication, medical. Basically any and every industry has capital equipment, and that capital equipment needs to be financed, and we work with them in acquiring that equipment. And this is some of the equipment that we finance. Commercial and corporate aircraft. We like to focus on essential use assets. So if they're using that aircraft as part of their day-to-day operations, we're interested in it. If it's an aircraft for an executive to fly to Palm Springs to do a golf trip, we're really not interested, because if economic times turn, that aircraft can be easily gotten rid of. Rail cars, rolling stock, trucks and transportation, business, retail and office equipment, IT equipment and software. We do lease software, which has a tangible a value to it of really nothing. But it's absolutely vital to the infrastructure and successful operation of a business, and that's why we lease it. And by the way, Bob, feel free to jump in on anything if you like.
Just jump in. One of my first transactions that I ever did, and I worked for the First National Bank of Chicago and their leasing company back in 1972. I leased 2 ships to Matson Navigation, and that was a pretty interesting deal. But when Jared says we lease everything, I mean we really do lease everything.
Everything.
Yeah.
We even looked at a submarine that goes underneath along the Mississippi River to repair bridges. So if it dies and runs out of power on the bottom of the river bottom, it's a little bit difficult for us to go get logistically. But those are the kind of things that we do. We do underground mining equipment, which is also quite risky. Yes?
You say when you lease everything, what came to my mind was, where do you guys get all the stuff to lease?
So that's a great question. I'm going to reserve that. The question he asked was, where do we get all the equipment to lease? We're going to talk about that. I think it's in the next deal or the one after when we get through this, and I'll help answer that question. Again, all the equipment ranges from anything you can imagine to everything you can probably imagine. It can and probably has been leased or will be leased. Okay, next still. Here you go. Let's see if I can answer it in this still. So this is how a lease works. I don't know if you guys can see this very well, but up here in the top, lessor, owner of the equipment, that's us, that's Mazuma. And what we do is we're invoiced by the vendor. So we get the equipment from the vendor or the manufacturer that produces those goods and services, that product. So if it's a submarine, that submarine manufacturer will send Mazuma an invoice. And we contract with our user for a payment stream. So they say, we want to go out and buy this submarine, or let's pick a semi, for example. England Trucking wants to buy a fleet of trucks. They negotiate with Peterbilt for the acquisition of those trucks, but rather than pay with out of their own cash flow for that, they contact us, and in exchange for a stream of payments, we agree to make payment to the vendor. So we get the equipment from the different manufacturers that produce those goods and services.
Yeah, we never choose the equipment. Our lessees choose the equipment, and then we finance it. And years ago, too, I worked for Zion's Leasing, and we leased a DC-10 to Western Airlines. And somehow, McDonnell Douglas thought that I made the equipment decisions on jumbo jets. So I used to get all this information on jumbo jets, you know, trying to, that you would get if you were a senior vice president of operations deciding what Western Airlines or Delta was going to use. So it was neat stuff, but I had no influence over any purchase decisions.
Right. This is actually a really important fact for us in our business, that we don't manufacture the equipment we lease. Because UCC code and the laws with that, if we manufacture the equipment, gives the lessee certain rights to set off or abate payment if guarantees or warranties on that product aren't being fulfilled. And in our case, that's a real problem. We want to make sure that payments are absolute and unconditional. It has a hell or high water clause in it. That's critical to equipment leasing. So if we were the manufacturer, then we have to make those representations, which we don't, which is a critical component. We want to lend them money, simply provide them financing for that product acquisition, and in return, receive a payment stream and make spread. And that's, in a nutshell, how we do that. So you can see we negotiate that with the vendor for the purchase of that equipment. We negotiate the terms and conditions of the contract with our end user. And sometimes there's a third-party investor or bank that might work with us in buying a stream of payments or investing part of that transaction that partners with us to help carry some of that risk and exposure. That looks more confusing than it is, but hopefully that made sense to you guys. All right.
Jared, it looks like those arrows go back and forth, explaining that it's a workable model, that it can change and fluctuate as necessary.
Absolutely, and that's a really good point. This stuff requires participation on both sides. It requires contracts between us and our investor. Most of this is transparent to our end user. They're unaware of it until there's an estoppel or an assignment of payments. Much like a home, if you guys or anyone in here has owned a home, you probably signed up with JP Morgan Chase, and 6 months later it's with SunTrust. That's kind of what's happening here behind the scenes. We're working on the stream of payments with different syndication partners to reduce the risk and exposure that we have on that overall financing package. And back and forth with the vendor in negotiating the price and the delivery of the equipment, and back and forth over here on the terms and conditions of that contract and the use and locations of that equipment. Yes?
One quick question. If I wrap my mind around it right, why not cut out the middleman and go straight to the vendor myself?
As far as buying the equipment, that'd be great, but a lot of vendors don't actually offer, and let me restate that question, I'm sorry. The question was, why not go directly to the vendor? And the reason is, the vendor usually doesn't provide financing. And also, if they do provide financing, it's only going to be on their equipment. So if they're looking for a financing package of, say, $5 million, going back to that England Trucking example, let's say they're looking for a $5 million fleet of vehicles, and that includes Peterbilt trucks, Mack trucks, international trucks, some trailers that are customized, some reefer units or refrigeration units to go on those trucks, some GPS handheld units. Now they have to go to each of those individual vendors and see if there's a financing package. And that becomes very, very complicated and time consuming. Here we can bundle the whole thing together and provide competitive rates and terms and conditions on that. Plus, a lot of those guys don't want to finance it. They're in the business of making vehicles. They're not in the business of financing. Unfortunately, a lot of the vendors have figured that out and that there's good money to be made in financing. So a lot of the large equipment manufacturers you see out there actually do have a financing arm, such as Caterpillar. Even in computer and technology, you see Dell, like Dell Financial Services, or IBM, which IBM Global Credit Corporation. They offer financing terms. They just don't like to go outside of their own box and equipment outside of what they manufacture. But great question. Okay. So these are some of the different structures. I don't think we have time to explain all the different kinds of structures that are out there, but just to give you some indication of how flexible and creative the industry can be, we do work through a lot of different types of structures to help our customers get the product and service that they're looking for and that it makes sense for them. So tax-oriented structures, which are really tax-focused, non-tax-oriented structures, typical loans or conditional sales contracts, balloon payments, operating leases, which is an expense on their balance sheet versus taking depreciation and owning that asset, lease facilities to handle not only one particular piece of equipment, but multiple pieces over a duration of time, sell and lease back options, which basically if they have equipment on their books that they've paid cash for and they need that capital back to grow their business or invest in other areas, this is an area where we can come in, take assignment or ownership rights to that equipment in exchange for a contract of payments. Step up and step down leases. This is very helpful with equipment that is revenue generating, that maybe they're buying a $2 million CNC lathe, that as that equipment gets installed and starts producing, they'll see increase in revenue, but they can't handle the payment until they get that product out the door. So the payments step up as that revenue starts flowing from the equipment that they acquire. Seasonal leases, we have a lot of companies that we work with that are very seasonal. We did some automated, I don't know if you know about this, Bob, we did some robots that go and move planters for pots. And their business is really a 3-month business. They really thrive in the spring and into the summer, but the rest of the time they starve. And so seasonal leases are very helpful there. Deferred payment options, bundled lease products, and non-tax operating leases and other tax gap products. So these are some of the structures that we get involved with in equipment leasing. Some of the advantages to leasing equipment, and this may go back to your earlier question, why would you lease? Well, you can obtain a fixed rate of capital. That's a challenge. Right now, we all know that capital is very, very low. And locking that in at a very low rate is an important thing for a lot of companies. 100% financing. If you go to finance something, typically it requires a large down payment. Maybe a 10 or 20% investment. Not necessarily in equipment leasing. We can do 100% of the capital acquisition cost.
And that's the banks. The banks, traditionally, if they were doing term loans, they always required a down payment. And then they would open up a equipment leasing affiliate, subsidiary, and do 100% financing on the same equipment to the same companies. It made no sense. The right hand was never talking to the left hand.
That's right.
But that was the reason that you got a lot of leasing business.
And we still get a lot of business from this reason right here. Because in business, cash is king. Cash flow is king. The ability to cash flow the business is absolutely vital, and being able to provide 100% of that acquisition cost on day one is critical. As we talked about earlier, the ability to match the stream of payments with the useful life of the equipment. So we try and pair that out. While it's providing utility, the payment structure is being supported by that revenue generation. Flexibility is the deployment and use of that equipment. They're not tied to where it is and not being able to move it or utilize it in different scenarios, where leasing gives them greater flexibility. Equipment management and replacement strategy, obsolescence sometimes comes into play with computers and technology. The ability to refresh and upgrade and get new equipment is also very critical to equipment leasing. Preferential tax and accounting treatment, this is ever changing, and on larger companies in particular, we see a lot of companies that are driven specifically by tax and accounting structures. In fact, we're working on a $7.5 million deal right now that is completely driven from accounting. That's the only reason they're doing the transaction. Deploy cash to more vital areas such as payroll, M&A, inventory, versus putting it into a depreciating asset. If you're buying equipment that's vital to operating the business, it does depreciate. And if you sink cash into that depreciating asset, you limit your ability to use that cash for things that are more important to your business. And that's really where leasing comes into play. Avoiding obsolescence, as we talked about, and access to an inexpensive cost of capital. Types of leasing companies. There's captives and vendors. We talked about that earlier. This is like Caterpillar, providing financing for their own product. Banks and large money centers. These are the big players out there you guys have heard of. Wells Fargo, JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, the big banks. Also some regional banks. Independents like us. Brokers. Brokers are guys that have key relationships with end users around the country, and they try and find an opportunity and then sell it to an independent or sell it to a bank. And we do work with some of those guys. And then boutique firms. This is really a new category that's creeped up in the last 5 or 6 years due to some of the economic turmoil that we've experienced. And we'll talk a little bit more about that.
A big one like that would be international lease finance, owned by AIG, and all they do is lease airplanes. If you want an airplane and you want it for a 2-year lease and it's a 30-year asset, go to international lease finance and they'll make that deal work for you. AIG is just trying to sell international lease finance because AIG got a big government bailout, and they figure that the government, us in this case, we're going to make a potload of dough when they sell international lease finance. It's a wonderful company.
That's right. And we see these specialized firms like that. Willis Leasing is another one that comes to mind. They just do aircraft engines. That's it. Just the engines. So they don't even finance the frame, the airframe, just the engines. So you see these very specialized firms that are popping up as a result of some of the things that are happening. And specialization yields profitability, particularly in this economy, and we're seeing that. Great. Okay, so our niche. We're an independent national direct lender in the middle market leasing category. That means we like to do transactions between $150,000 to $10 million plus. We like to work with middle market companies that have about $5 million in tangible net worth up to $100 million in tangible net worth. Revenue between $20 million and really $1 billion in annual sales revenue. Once you start getting above that $1 billion number and the credits get very, very good, we've seen such an incredibly competitive landscape where most banks and leasing companies have really migrated away from risk, that it's become incredibly competitive. You'll see 15, maybe even 17 competitors on a good credit deal, and the winning bid is 2.38%, variable fixed for 7 years. Can't really make any money in that category, so that's not where we play. We play in this.
Do you even bother to reply to RFPs, requests for proposals?
We'll call on an RFP, and if there's less than 5 people that they've sent that to, yes. If we have more than 5 competitors on any deal, we bail out. And the reason that we bail out, if there's multiple competitors, we know that the landscape in equipment leasing can get so competitive, and there's some unscrupulous lenders out there that'll promise things they can't deliver. It just gets too difficult. We want them to iron out and narrow it down to 3 or 4 real players. And if we've got 3 or 4 people bidding, we like to bid and play. But if we're one of 17, no thanks. We're going to pass and go to a different dance. So yeah, we're in the middle market category. We like middle market credit and good collateral, or top tier credit and bad collateral. So we'll look at great credits that have challenging collateral, where the mainstream market doesn't want to lend, like software or underground mining equipment. You throw a stick of dynamite down a shaft, mining shaft, you don't get your equipment back. That's a little risky for a lot of these big guys. But we like that stuff. So a top tier credit with bad collateral will play ball, or bad credit and bad collateral if it's structured correctly. So we do also play in the realm of structured finance. And these are enhancements like cash security deposits, letters of credit, shortening the term, mitigating our risk in a business type way, not looking solely at the credit side.
I know that one of an example on that was we had a really good equipment company headquartered in New York City. They were Standard & Poor's AA or A+, and we leased to them paint on their walls and wallpaper, because you would lend to them unsecured. Well, basically, we were leasing to them unsecured, but it worked.
Paint.
Paint.
Paint for the wall.
Yeah, it was good paint.
Leasehold improvements. That's not something you want to repossess.
No, it's really hard to repossess that stuff.
And that's the fun thing about our industry is with the right credit, you can do just about anything. If the credit's not there, then we start to really look hard at that secondary source of repayment through the collateral. That's where it gets fun. So we look for good transactions with a few hiccups. If they're good transactions without any hiccups, it gets really, really competitive right now. So we want a few hiccups. We want the collateral that's underground. We want paint, if it's a good credit, software, or we want a good company that maybe has a little bit of hiccup on the financial side, but solid collateral. Those are also things we'll look at. Thank you. So how do we make money? We make money on spread, which means if we partner with a bank or lending institution on, say, an 80% advance rate, like Bob was mentioning, they don't like to do 100% financing. So if we sell them a stream of payments for approximately 80% of that original cost of equipment, they might sell us that at 3%. If we're charging the customer 5%, we make the difference in spread on a present value basis. So that's income for us. We also make money during the installation period as equipment is being installed and brought onto location, much like a construction loan. We also make money on deposits. We usually require a deposit to the last payment. The time value of money gives us an enhancement there. And we make money on residual and equity investment. So when you do a lease, particularly an operating lease where there's a residual component to it, you have equipment that over the course of a 36-month contract, for example, they may be paying 90 cents of the original dollar to buy that equipment. $1 million lease, present value back on those payments only pays $900,000 back. So that 10% equity investment is our residual. We put that money out to the vendor on day one, and at the end of the lease, they negotiate to purchase that equipment from us, and there's great upside there for us as well, particularly on high-value equipment. So we see a great deal of our income coming from this category.
And that can be by far the riskiest part of the deal.
By far.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. This is by far and away the riskiest part of the deal, as Bob mentioned, for a couple of reasons. One, we're rolling the dice that that company survives because our position is secondary to any investment partner we have. So if we've sold the stream of payments to a bank, if they default 18, 20 months into a 36-month contract, and we go get that collateral and we sell it for 50 cents on the dollar, if the bank isn't made whole in that process, we're out the 10% or the $100,000 equity investment we made to buy the equipment on day one. We lose that, it's gone. So it can be very risky, and that's why banks don't like to play in our space. Okay. These are some recent transactions that we've done. Just to give you some indication of what we do, anywhere from $150,000 to $10 million in total transaction size. Like I said, we're hoping to close on a $7.5 million deal here tomorrow. Should be
Tomorrow?
fun. Yes, tomorrow.
Attaboy.
Should be fun. So this gives you an indication. Underground mining equipment, wheel loaders. This was interesting. This was a smokestack scrubber for a coal plant. Basically, it's to reduce the emissions that is emitted from this coal plant. Going to get that in the event of a default would be pretty difficult. You need a really tall ladder. And you'd have a really hard time removing it and reselling it somewhere. So we had to really understand the credit aspects here to get comfortable with that risk, which we felt comfortable. Yellow iron, mining equipment, a power plant over there. So we do a lot in mining and energy, renewable energy space, medical, things of that nature.
Well, if they want to run that power plant, they've got to have your scrubber.
They do. There are laws with
Yeah.
the EPA. They have to have certain particulate emissions, and if they blow past that, they're in real
And
trouble.
they probably have long-term contracts for the power from other sources, either the power company or big, huge industrial corporations. And so they're not just generating some electricity and hoping that somebody wants it.
That's right. In fact, our contract allows us to say you can discontinue use of that immediately. And because of that, that's how we got comfortable with it. Is the second we say, you've got to stop using our equipment right now, they're in real trouble. And that gives us the ability to assure that we're going to receive the payments, which is great.
Y'all understand yellow iron?
The yellow iron is like,
Understand what yellow iron is? You want to explain yellow iron?
Yellow iron is like big earth-moving equipment, construction equipment, like cat wheel loaders would be yellow iron.
Caterpillar equipment.
Yes.
It's painted, it's iron and it's painted yellow.
That's right. That's right. So big Volvo or Caterpillar
Yeah.
backhoes and diggers and scrapers, things like that. Great. Okay, so this is kind of fun stuff. So here's some of the macroeconomic issues that are impacting everyone, and particularly us in 2013. So what we're seeing across the board in the country, we're seeing companies that are very cash rich. They've withheld investment, there's an aging infrastructure out there, and there's pent-up demand. Interestingly, this is caused from this, and we'll talk about this in a minute, but it's perception. It's the perception of the macroeconomy. Companies don't want to go out and spend if they feel like it's not the right time to spend. If you had $1 million in the bank, you might not go out and buy a Ferrari, even if you've got the money right now, because it just doesn't seem like the right thing to do in this economy. And so that perception is actually quite centric to investment in capital equipment, and we're seeing that. The problem with that is these companies that have been hoarding cash and letting their infrastructure degrade, they're at the point now where they're not able to fulfill the contracts they have because their equipment is starting to become so obsolete. So there really is this aging infrastructure that's become a major problem in the US, and that pent-up demand is starting to really push capital investment regardless of what's happening with macroeconomic issues. So we're seeing that. Quantitative easing is expected to continue at a rate of 45 billion. Yes, that's 45 billion a month through Q1. Thank you, federal government. I'm not a big fan of that. But that is expected to go through Q1 of 2014. It could cause possible inflation. Inflation could be a good thing for equipment leasing in that the cost of the capital goes up, the acquisition price goes up, and our spreads go up. We're not a big fan of hyperinflation, but a moderate level of inflation could be good for our business. Fed's stated interest rate environment will stay low through 2014. They've announced that they're going to keep it low where it is and drive interest rates down through 2014 to help spur economic activity. And that's expected to go through mid-2014. We'll see continued regulatory pressure on the banks. Post-2008, the banks have been smothered by the federal regulators. They want to diversify their funding sources, diversify their collateral. There's cross-stratification across all industry types and sourcing. And the banks are feeling the pressure from the regulators. And because of that, they've been increasing the cash that they have on in their depository relationships and have reluctance to lend. And so you have a lot of banks that have huge Tier 1 capital right now, but aren't lending in the middle market leasing arena, in the middle market space, because of this regulatory pressure. They don't want the risk of the Fed saying, why did you make that bad loan? Because they're being breathed on hard by the Feds. We'll see continued self-regulation in the world of independence, which is where we play ball, which is great. We're kind of quasi-regulated because we do work with the banks, and because we have a lot of syndication relationships there, we see that relationship, but we are not regulated, which gives us great flexibility as the deployment and use of funds for capital investment, which makes us very, very effective. The MLFI, which is the Monthly Leasing and Finance Index, basically goes out and surveys the perception of companies across the country. And what they're seeing right now is that corporate perception is the economic outlook for 2013 will be positive. And a result of that being positive, they expect to make investment decisions that will drive capital investment. So we expect that this will continue to be the biggest driver, is perception. If perception is strong, companies will go out and buy equipment. This was huge for us. Section 179, which is a tax code provision, was increased in 2013. We thought it was going to go away. That was a big rumor with the Bush tax cuts expiring and everything that was happening at the end of last year. But they actually increased it to $500,000. So anything over $2 million in investment that a business makes, they can take dollar for dollar deduction up to $500,000 under Section 179 through 2013. And bonus depreciation, which is 50% of anything they buy in 2013, can be fully depreciated in 2013. This also renewed in 2013, which was set to expire in 2012. We didn't find out the news on this until the first week of January, which was also great. There's big changes in our world for FASB 13. FASB is Financial Accounting Standards Board, and IASB is the International Accounting Standards Board. These are the regulatory bodies that govern equipment leasing and how things are presented for accounting standards. And they've talked about changing how operating leases will work for really 5 or 6 years. That's been on the agenda. It's gone through several reiterations. They've had a few drafts come out, but they expect to have a final draft this year. So these are some of the things that are happening in the macroeconomy.
And actually, they really started talking about that in the 70s.
Really?
Yeah, they just never have gotten around to doing anything. And the last 5 years, they've gotten pretty serious about it. But
wow.
30 years before that, they were still talking about it.
Well, and they had committed to a 2012 date 3 or 4 years ago, and that's come and gone. So it's kind of anyone's guess. Yes. Great. So here's what we see the outlook for the industry to be in 2013. Business size will have a tremendous impact on demand. So we expect to see large and medium-sized companies increasing investment, while small companies will continue to temper their capital equipment and investments. We think the reason the small companies will temper their investments is because they have less access to the mainstream credit markets, and they're also more exposed to volatility, the ups and downs that happen on the day-to-day side of the economy, where a mid-sized company and a larger company can really weather that storm a little bit more. Pent-up demand and aging infrastructure will help rally an expected pickup in the second half of the year. We're really banking on that. These are the big growth industries for 2013. So as you come out of college and you're looking for a job, talk to us or talk to one of these guys. Medical, IT and cloud computing is big right now. Every company is moving to cloud computing, and we are financing that, believe it or not. We're financing equipment that's going into a third-party warehouse. It's just an IT space, a building, where they are leasing a small part of that space for an IT hardware project to run their software. Oil and gas is seeing tremendous investment, and renewable energy sectors will all see double-digit investment growth in 2013. Brokers, generic and independents will continue to struggle. We'll see that really fall apart in 2013. Some of these guys that are barely hanging on are probably going to die. Generic independents. We're an independent, but we fund with our own money internally. We carry residual risk. We're a large independent, and that really separates us from some of these small-time players out there. Surviving bottom-tier credit firms will probably dry up. These are guys that have taken risk on bad credits. If they're surviving now, they probably won't through the end of 2013 unless they do structured finance. Specialty firms will thrive. This has been a really unique category since 2008. New cash-rich players will enter the market, and we've seen this. Scottrade, and a big investment bank, you know who Scottrade is, most of you. They just announced they're going to get into equipment leasing.
Really?
Scottrade.
That's not good.
And we're seeing that. We're seeing hedge funds and private equity firms. I get a call or email at least once a week from a private equity investment group wanting to either buy us or fund transactions in the right way. They have a lot of cash, and they don't know how to deploy that cash in a safe environment. They're not able to get those 30% returns that they're used to, and so they're trying to be more conservative in this economy, and they're looking at equipment leasing as a possibility. So because of that, we're going to see increased M&A activity in our space. We've seen that through the latter half of 2012. There was a big rally. 2013 is expected to be much larger. We're going to see a slow easing of credit standards. This is great because it's going to delve down into the middle market a little bit, and then once that loosens up, you'll really see the economy start to pick up steam. This is really what's holding the economy from getting traction right now. I'm not an economist, but that's my 2 cents. Until the credit standards loosen in that middle market category, you're going to see kind of a ticky-tacky increase with the economy. When that starts to slow and open up to that middle market category, we'll get back to some really good growth. IASB pre-adoption will fuel investment. Because of the draft that's coming out this year, a lot of companies are being proactive. They're trying to forecast what that draft is going to look like and structure leases to fit that. So we'll see that also fuel some investment. Continued self-regulation of independents. That was supposed to be on the last deal, so that's a mistake. Sorry. 2013 should see $1.4 trillion in total investment with $742 billion financed or leased. That's the forecast. So in 2011, it was 630. 2012, it was 702. 2013, it's 742, which will be the largest ever, which means that we are getting back to good growth, even pre-2008 numbers, which is great.
Yeah, 5% is a good growth.
It's a good number, yeah.
Yeah. That's it.
Okay. Our mission statement, Mazuma Capital is committed to our clients' success. Our unique capabilities and innovative product offerings provide solutions that accelerate financial growth. This is our core focus. It's what we do. We want to provide much needed capital to help stimulate the economy and stimulate growth within the organizations that we work with. This tells you a little bit about our motto again. We build long-term relationships by delivering on our commitments. I think the next still is our vision. One more. Continue to build a reputation as a strong, well-respected middle market industry leader, resulting in bottom line profitability and long-term accumulation of capital. That's what we're trying to do. And one more, our values. We're committed to a high code of ethical conduct. We subscribe to the NAELB, which is the National Association of Equipment Lease Brokers. We helped author the Utah Best Practice Alliance for ethics and how to conduct business in equipment leasing, and we subscribe to the ELFA Code of Fair Business Practices. So these are some of the things that we do to self-regulate in our industry, even though we're not regulated. We feel there's a great responsibility to being an active member in the community and in the equipment leasing space. And then I think we're to question and answer. Okay. So Bob, come on up. Questions do you guys have? Yes?
I'm not sure if you went into it, but you talked about your transaction size range, but what's the market cap range that you guys do work in? I heard you say middle market. I'm just curious what the actual numbers are.
Okay, so the question is the market cap for companies that we work with?
Yeah, like minimum, maximum, like what's that window? Like obviously larger corporations can still work in that transaction size range, but like you say, you don't want to go, you don't really like working with companies that get up to that point sometimes.
Yeah, it's hard to answer that question because the answer will always be it depends. Mm-hmm. It depends on the credit and it depends on the collateral that we're looking at and the structure. So if we've got a Fortune 500 company we're working with, Dow Chemical, could we do that deal? Yes. The only reason it would really come into our space is if the collateral was too risky for most of the other players. So our core spot is really 10 million in annual sales revenue to about 250 million in revenue. Sometimes up to $1 billion. But a company with more than $1 billion, like Apple, they're just cash rich, they don't need us. But if they want to finance some equipment, and that equipment is something that the mainstream market just doesn't want to take risk in, then that's where we'd be a player. So it depends on the credit, depends on the collateral.
When I was in the business, we used to love BB credits. You know, they're just below investment grade, but they're really good companies.
Yeah.
And so if you've got, some of your major money center banks and big players, their charge is to go out and do investment grade credits. And so if you do BBs, they're about the same. And that was perfect for us.
Absolutely. Great.
So where did you get the initial capital to start this business? Get to buy all the equipment and it doesn't pay off for a while?
I'm kidding. We invested with our own money. We got commitments when we started the business. We wanted to grow it organically. So we actually started an office that was about, I'd say, half the size of this room. And there were 2 shareholders and then 2 employees. And we could have started with an infrastructure of 15, 20, 30 employees and required several $1 million to start. But we wanted to grow it organically. And so we got commitments for a large amount of money. We never really dipped into that. We went in about $400,000 or $500,000 before we started turning a profit, which is a lot of money to invest, but really small by equipment lease standards. Today, to get into this industry, you probably need a good 2 or 3, 4, maybe 5 million of capital to start. Yeah, great question. Yes?
Where's the most clients that you have? Is it a lot in Utah, and how do you market?
You want to answer that?
Now, to me, this was unbelievable too. When I'm an old banker, and so I was kind of working at Zions, and then we've done some other deals, and we hired a guy and came here to Utah, and we started doing business all over the United States from our offices here. And we have, Jared, you'll have 25 or 30 sales guys on the phones calling all over the United States and do business in 50 states. And actually, we don't do a whole lot of business in Utah.
Yeah, less than 10 customers in Utah. Mostly, it's the major business centers. So a lot of Southern California, and East Coast, New York,
Yeah.
Texas. Where there's large business, that's where we
If
tend to
they've got an
focus on.
NFL team, they're probably a candidate.
That's right. Yeah. When we get an NFL team, we'll start doing more business here.
Do you do most of your marketing online?
We do a lot of online marketing. That's new. Really, since about 2009, we haven't had an investment strategy in social media, but our EVP of Marketing and Strategic Development has really opened that up for us. In 2009, we didn't have a single person calling us looking for a deal. Today, we have between 6 and 10 leads a week, and that's through LinkedIn, social media, Facebook, Pinterest. I don't even know the stuff because I don't play in those realms, but our marketing director does, and it really is the wave of the future, certainly. Yes.
I had so many questions, but I know we kind of lost the time, but how much has your business been dependent on you guys being able to get along with people or your customers?
The question is how much are we dependent upon third-party syndication sources, kind of?
So for your ability to be able to get along with people, because they say people are business. If you can't get along with your customer, then your business probably won't.
Your
Right.
relationships.
Yeah. Yeah, I think our business is complete. To answer the question again is how dependent are we on the customer and their relationship to get a loan? Very much so. If we can't get an approval for our customer base, we'll lose our customers. And that process has certainly elongated. Before 2008, our average turnaround was about 7 days, 5 to 7 days. Today, it's probably close to 2 weeks. We can still turn around a transaction in as short as 5 business days in the right situation. But even at an average of just under 2 weeks, we're still about a week ahead of almost everyone out there. It's a 3-week turnaround.
And Jared does that very well, his relationship with his customers, and that can be measured by how many customers come back to you and do another deal. I've been affiliated and seen companies over the years, and no one ever came back to them and did another deal. One of the first big leasing deals ever done was Citibank leased the new 727s that came over that were being acquired or leased by United Airlines. And no one knew how long a 727 was going to last. And so, they last about 30 years. But everyone assumed 10 years. 10 years later, they figured those 727s would be worth nothing. And so they had a fair market value purchase option. Well, when the end of the 10 years came about, the 727s were worth 100% of what they'd paid for them 10 years ago. And they had a fair market value purchase option. So United went to Citibank and said, hey, we thought we were going to pay 10% for these, and you told us that. They said, well, show us where we told you that. And they hadn't written it anywhere. And so they were holding them to the fire for 100%. And United said, look, if you charge us something like that, we're taking our whole banking relationship from your bank. Now that was a big deal. And Citibank said, at least in their negotiations, we're going to miss you. Because it was that was serious money they were talking about. Well, they finally renegotiated, and United didn't pay 10%, but they didn't pay 100%, and they stayed at Citibank.
That's the challenge for us. That's a great point. We're always trying to balance profitability with relationship. And so, we're not the lowest cost of funds in the market, and we're not the payday loan centers. We're in the middle. We're in the middle. And so when we provide financing to customers that can't get credit, they know it's going to be not the cheapest out there, but it's going to be access to a cost of funds that they can't get elsewhere. So we had a deal that went end of term. It was underground mining equipment. That value came back close to $1.5 million for an equipment lease that they had paid roughly 95% over the term of the lease. So they had $1.5 million. It came out to about $1.3 million more than they anticipated paying for this equipment. And they didn't want to pay it. But in the end of the negotiations, they did, and we just did another $5.5 million deal with them. And the reason that we kept that relationship is we reduced it to a value where we could make it work, balance the relationship with the opportunity for future business, and keep a happy customer. We could have turned around and charged them a lot more for that equipment. We decided not to keep the relationship going in the right way. If it was a 727 and it was $20 million, we might have changed our mind and told them to enjoy their new relationship, but that's not what we're about. Great question. We out of time, or we have time for a couple more?
You got any more questions? Okay, I guess.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jared. Thank you, Bob. That was. Did you get a lot out of that? Understand? Sure. Broad perspective. You may want to get Jared's card, and for your business or for future relationships. So, whatever you think.
If you're getting into equipment finance or finance in general after college, let me know. We're always interested. We're growing.